Welcome back to Mission of the Chosen. Today we dive into a truth most people never see coming: how silence, restraint, and unseen strength become your greatest weapons in battles you didn't choose. They never expected you to play the game differently. They were watching for noise, waiting for the explosion, convinced that your victory would come only if you matched their chaos with your own. That's the mistake that blinds so many people. They assume everyone fights on the same level they do. But you didn't. You didn't shout back. You didn't throw wild punches. You didn't waste your energy scrambling to prove a point to people who never deserved the proof in the first place. Instead, you let silence sharpen itself into a blade. Think of silence this way: it's not the absence of action. It's the storing of power. It's the storm before lightning splits the sky. To them, silence looked like surrender. To you, silence was discipline. And because of that, they misunderstood you from the beginning. They only understood battles that were loud, messy, and public. They thought whoever screamed the loudest had the upper hand. But you weren't chasing attention. You were building endurance. You were learning. You were collecting every slip, every false move, every little sign they thought went unnoticed. That's why you didn't fight on their terms. You fought on yours. Imagine two boxers stepping into the ring. One is frantic, swinging with all his might, exhausting himself in the first round. The crowd cheers at his fury, but across from him, the second boxer hardly moves. He observes, he waits, and when the first boxer collapses from his own wasted strength, the second is still fresh, still sharp, and ready to end the fight with one precise strike. That's the role you played. You weren't running out of breath trying to match them. You were preserving yours, keeping it steady, waiting until the right moment revealed itself. The irony? They laughed at your stillness. They thought quiet meant cowardice. They thought calm meant ignorance. In truth, it was their arrogance that blinded them. Every time they mocked you, they were writing the story of their own collapse. Because the truth is this: the strongest fighters aren't the ones who swing the most, they're the ones who know when not to swing at all. Psychology even backs this up. Studies show that silence in conflict disarms people more than anger does. Why? Because anger is predictable. Silence isn't. Anger can be manipulated. Silence leaves them scrambling, confused, desperate to provoke a reaction that never comes. And that's what you mastered. While they were wasting energy trying to pull you into their theater, you were behind the curtain studying the entire play. You weren't afraid. You were calculating. And that calculation gave you an edge no amount of noise could compete with. So ask yourself, what's more devastating? Losing a fight you knew was coming, or realizing there was a fight happening all along and you never even knew you were already losing? That's the position you put them in. By giving them nothing, you gave yourself everything. You fooled them into believing you weren't even playing. But you were playing all along on a higher level, in an arena they didn't even know existed. And the result? They underestimated you so completely that when the truth finally surfaced, it wasn't just a loss, it was humiliation. Because they didn't just lose a battle, they lost the illusion that they ever understood who you really were. The deadliest mask is the smile that hides the blade. Chosen one, that's what you wore. And they never suspected it. They thought they knew you, thought you were soft, harmless, someone they could toy with. But the truth, you fooled them completely. They were looking at you with blind eyes. And while they were busy underestimating you, you were sharpening something far sharper than steel: your spirit, your focus, your willpower. Now imagine this for a moment. Chosen one, a chess player who pretends to be distracted, fumbling pieces on purpose, letting the opponent laugh at his mistakes. Then with one sudden move, checkmate. That's you. And the look on their faces when they realize you weren't the fool, but the hidden assassin in the game. That shock is priceless. Here's a fact the universe proves over and over again: the most dangerous threats are never the loudest ones. It's not always the roaring lion that claims victory. It's often the serpent in the grass, silent and unseen, that changes everything in an instant. Studies in psychology even show that people are wired to underestimate the quiet, the calm, the overlooked ones. They assume silence means weakness, when in reality silence means calculation. That's why your enemies misjudged you so badly. They thought you were the background character when you were actually writing the script the entire time. And now they sit in confusion, replaying every memory of you, wondering how they missed the signs. And thank you, Chosen One, for being here with me. Don't forget to pay this message back by pressing the like button and subscribing so this light can spread to more souls. It's our duty to keep this force alive and strong. You are part of a mission, part of a movement, part of a force much larger than you realize. So, thank you, Chosen One, for carrying this responsibility with us. Now, let's come back to it because the truth must be said. You fooled them in a way they'll never forget. They thought they had your character stamped, thought they could put you in a box labeled weak, harmless, forgettable, but what they didn't know is that you were a walking storm in disguise. You smiled, you stayed quiet, you blended in, but underneath it all, you were collecting every piece of information, watching every false move, waiting for the moment to strike, not with violence, but with undeniable proof of who you are. That's what makes you the spiritual assassin. Not the kind that wields a blade, but the kind that dismantles illusions, exposes lies, and leaves no room for denial. They will never admit it out loud, but you shook them to their core. They didn't just lose control of their schemes, they lost control of their perception of you. That's the real power. When someone realizes they never truly knew you, when they see the mask slip and the truth underneath, it rattles them more than any defeat ever could. And that's exactly what you've done, Chosen One. You've turned their laughter into silence, their gossip into whispers, and their certainty into doubt. They didn't expect you to be the one holding the unseen power, but that's what makes the deception so complete. And here's the beauty of it all. The universe always works through irony. The ones who parade themselves as strong often collapse when they're hit by something subtle, something they never planned for. You became that force. You were the strike they didn't prepare for, the twist they never wrote into their script. And now, Chosen One, they live with the unease of knowing that the person they once mocked, the one they overlooked, is the very one who dismantled them without lifting a single weapon. They thought they had you figured out because they could see the surface of your life. To them, that was enough. Your words, your posts, the way you carried yourself in public. They measured you in snapshots, believing appearances held the whole truth. But appearances are shallow, and shallow waters can't tell the story of an ocean. While they obsessed over surface ripples, you were operating in the depths. You knew the game wasn't happening in what could be seen, but in what remained unseen. That's where you built your strength, where you planned your moves, where your real victories took shape. Picture this. Two people stand at the edge of the sea. One skips stones, laughing at how many times they bounce across the surface. They think they've conquered the water. The other dives below, learning the currents, exploring treasures hidden in silence, discovering dangers the stone thrower will never touch. Which of them has mastery? Which of them is shaping outcomes? The one who plays on top, or the one who commands below? That's you. Your enemies never dove deep. They believed the ocean ended at what they could see. They never realized you weren't confined to their shallow games. You moved where they couldn't follow, listened where they couldn't hear, built patience where they only built noise. Here's what shallow fighters never understand. Their weapons are always surface level. Gossip, money, status, attention. These are tools for the impatient. They need people to see them swinging, shouting, straining, because visibility is the only proof they know. If it isn't loud, they think it isn't real. But you learned the truth early. The loudest doesn't always win. The deep doesn't need applause to prove it's strong. In fact, the deep doesn't explain itself at all. It waits. It watches. And when the time is right, it moves with a force no surface noise can stop. Think of a tree. From the outside, the trunk may look strong, but the roots tell the real story. If those roots are rotting, collapse is inevitable. By the time anyone notices the tree fall, the damage has already been working in silence, unseen and unstoppable. That's how you dismantled them. You weren't striking at branches for show. You were addressing roots, removing their foundation before they even knew it was weakening. And because of that, every time they believed they had you cornered, they were standing on unstable ground. They thought you were passive. They mistook your patience for ignorance. They told themselves, "We're ahead. We're stronger. We've got this." Meanwhile, you were dismantling the very soil their illusions stood on. Imagine a card game. One player boasts loudly, convinced their dramatic hand slaps and bold declarations make them untouchable. But across from them sits someone calm, watching, noting every nervous twitch when a bluff is made, every shift in tone when a lie approaches. By the time the cards hit the table, the outcome isn't a surprise, it's a certainty. That was you. You didn't need to guess. Their habits exposed them, and your silence let them believe they were safe while they revealed every secret. The cruelest truth for them is this: shallow waters collapse under weight. Their lies couldn't hold the pressure. Their noise couldn't endure the silence. The schemes they thought were brilliant cracked under the gravity of time. You didn't need to unmask them forcefully. You let them unmask themselves by trying to swim where only depth survives. And while they kept sprinting, chasing attention, you conserved your energy. You chose endurance over performance. They exhausted themselves fighting battles that never touched you, while you held your ground, still, strong, unshaken. That's why they can't understand why they're drained and you're not. They lived shallow. You lived deep. They fought for a stage. You built an ocean. Depth doesn't seek validation. It doesn't need to clap back, post proof, or win applause. It simply exists, steady and immovable. That's why you never looked frantic. You weren't scrambling to prove yourself, you were too anchored to need their recognition. The deeper you went, the more irrelevant their surface struggles became. Psychologists even confirm this. People who rely on shallow measures of success, status, gossip, appearances, burn out faster. Their energy is tied to external validation. But those who root themselves in depth, in patience, discipline, clarity, endure storms without collapse. That's why you're still here, still rising, while they wonder how everything slipped through their fingers. Now think about the power of currents. On the surface, the ocean can look calm, harmless, inviting. But beneath, invisible forces are shaping the direction of ships, pulling tides, carrying weight strong enough to move steel. That's what unsettles them most. You never had to shout, because the current you carried was already moving everything. They thought you were inactive, you were inevitable, and now they're confused. They sit restless, replaying every interaction, asking, how did we miss it? How did we not see what was happening? The answer is simple. They were staring at waves while you were commanding tides. They were chasing foam while you were building storms. They still won't admit it out loud, but the evidence is in the outcomes. Their schemes collapsed, their gossip dried out, their energy scattered, and you, silent and steady, are still moving forward with clarity. That's what depth does. It doesn't argue. It doesn't fight for the stage. It swallows the stage whole. So let them keep splashing. Let them play with stones and waves. You'll keep moving where the real power lives. And the truth is this: shallow waters will always make the most noise, but only deep waters can move the ship. And that's your brilliance. You didn't just survive their shallow games. You drowned them in silence. They were splashing for attention, but you were the tide, and the tide always wins. They strutted around as if they were unpredictable, unique, even untouchable. To them, every move they made felt clever, every scheme felt fresh. They believed they were operating on a higher level, outsmarting everyone around them, including you. But the reality was far less flattering. Nothing about them was new to you. You had seen their type before. You had studied their tactics. You knew the recycled patterns they dressed up as original. Every trick they thought was genius was nothing more than a rerun of a show you had already watched. And in your mind, you had memorized the ending before the first scene even began. That's why you never panicked. Why would you? Their attempts at surprise were only obvious reruns. Every lunge forward was another cliché. Every new strategy was a copy of the same tired pattern: envy, manipulation, betrayal, pride. They thought they were ambushing you, but all they were doing was walking into a cycle they couldn't escape. Imagine a chess master sitting across from a beginner who thinks random pawn movements make them unpredictable. The beginner smiles, convinced their chaos is brilliance. But the master isn't fooled. He isn't shaken. He's bored, because the master knows the sequence, sees the traps before they form, and already holds the strategy that decides the endgame. That's you. While they scrambled to act clever, you were watching inevitability unfold. This is where foresight becomes your greatest weapon. Psychology shows that under stress, people revert to habit-driven behaviors, repeating the same mistakes, exposing the same weaknesses. They didn't know this, but you did. That's why they could never truly shock you. Every desperate move they made came straight from the script you already studied. Their arrogance blinded them to their own predictability, while your clarity turned their patterns into weaknesses. Think of it this way. A hunter sets the same trap in the same place day after day, bragging about their cunning. But you've already mapped the forest. You walk past without effort, without fear. You don't waste energy dismantling the trap. It has no power over someone who refuses to step into it. That's how you move through their schemes. And here's what unsettled them most. They weren't just losing battles, they were losing the illusion that they were ever in control. You didn't need to fight harder, you didn't need to swing louder, you only needed to see clearly. Because once you saw their anchors, pride, greed, envy, you knew exactly where every path would lead them. Their own habits chained them more effectively than anything you could have done. That's the humiliation they can't forget. It wasn't that you won with overwhelming strength. It was that you never had to fight at all. They had written a script, certain of your role in it, but you weren't acting, you had already read the ending. And when the curtain fell, the only ones exposed were the authors of their own downfall. They told themselves they had power because they had noise, gossip, alliances, and appearances. But appearances don't rewrite destiny. Their entire performance was predictable, and nothing predictable can ever defeat someone who thrives on clarity. You weren't watching in fear, you were watching with foresight. And foresight dismantles illusions faster than any battle cry ever could. And so they stand now, not only defeated but disoriented. What hurts most isn't that they lost, it's that they never even understood the game. They thought they were the unpredictable storm. In truth, they were only lightning flashes, temporary, noisy, gone before they even realized they'd burned themselves out. You saw every pattern, every repetition, every loop, and by the time they realized it, the game had already ended. That's the brilliance of clarity. It doesn't just protect you, it exposes them. They thought they were authors, but you were always holding the pen. They believed mercy meant you were weak. They looked at your forgiveness, your patience, your refusal to retaliate in obvious ways, and they told themselves it was proof of fear. To them, kindness was timidity, restraint was cowardice, and silence was surrender. They laughed when you smiled instead of shouted. They thought your heart was begging for approval. They assumed your softness meant you were unable to strike. But here's what they never realized: mercy was never weakness. Mercy was the sharpest blade you carried. Mercy is not a lack of strength. Mercy is strength so complete it doesn't need to perform. Mercy is power so steady it doesn't flinch at insult. Mercy is control so precise that it allows the enemy to unravel on their own. That's what your restraint did. It wasn't passivity, it was calculation. It was the discipline of someone who knew time would expose everything without lifting a finger. Imagine a battlefield. One army is loud, chaotic, swinging wildly, desperate to prove dominance. The other stands in formation, waiting, calm, refusing to waste energy. To the untrained eye, the loud army looks stronger. But what happens after an hour? The noisy fighters are exhausted, their strategies broken, their formation shattered. The patient army has barely moved, and when they do strike, it is devastating. That was your mercy. You didn't waste your strength on every provocation. You let them burn themselves out while you remained unshaken. Think of a coiled serpent, motionless, silent, watching. Its prey begins to relax, convinced danger has passed. The mouse grows careless, emboldened, believing it has escaped. But the serpent's stillness was never weakness, it was strategy. And when the strike comes, it is not frantic or sloppy. It is precise. It is final. That's what your mercy was. By holding back, you gave them room to reveal themselves. By forgiving, you allowed them to stack the evidence of their own betrayal. By remaining silent, you let them tighten the noose with their own hands. This is a principle most people overlook. Restraint is the purest form of authority. Anyone can lash out, anyone can scream when hurt. That takes no discipline. But to remain calm, to stay grounded, to withhold reaction, even when wronged, that's mastery. And mastery unsettles people, because it proves you were never controlled by them. Every time they tried to provoke you, they thought your lack of reaction meant they had the upper hand. What they didn't realize was that your patience was proof of dominance. You weren't playing their game. You weren't bending to their script. You were sitting in command, choosing not to waste fire on straw. And the longer you withheld, the clearer their desperation became. They grew louder. They grew sloppier. They exposed themselves more and more while you kept your ground. And that drove them mad, because in their minds, they were winning. They thought they were humiliating you. But the real humiliation came later, when they realized your silence wasn't fear, it was calculation. By the time the truth surfaced, their reputation had collapsed not by your hand, but by their own. And here's the irony, they'll never admit it. They'll never say, "We lost because of their mercy." but deep down, they know it. It eats at them. Because the collapse hurt more than if you had struck them directly. If you had lashed out, they could have justified it. If you had fought on their terms, they could have claimed a battle. But mercy left them no defense. It dismantled their pride without you ever needing to lift your voice. History remembers this pattern. Leaders who abuse power don't always fall by violent revolt. Often, they collapse under the weight of their own corruption, while those they mocked simply endure. Mercy lets time work, and time is the one force arrogance can't conquer. That's what you understood. You didn't need to rush. You didn't need to prove anything. You knew patience would reveal what anger never could. And so, when the moment finally arrived, when truth rose to the surface, it wasn't messy. It wasn't loud. It was undeniable. Their own actions, their own betrayals, their own arrogance delivered the final blow, and you stood there, steady, with the record of everything they had written themselves. That's why mercy terrified them more than anger. Anger would have proven they mattered enough to provoke you. Mercy proved the opposite, that they never held power in the first place. Mercy said, I see you, but you are not worth my storm. And that realization is what crushed them. Because in the end, mercy was never surrender. Mercy was disguise. It was strategy. It was timing. It was the slow tightening of a rope that they gladly placed around their own neck. They thought they were winning, but every step forward was a step into their own trap. And when collapse came, it wasn't you swinging the blade, it was them, choking on their own arrogance, destroyed by the very stage they built for themselves. That's why mercy is the deadliest weapon, not because it strikes first, but because it strikes last. Not because it wounds the body, but because it dismantles the illusion. Not because it humiliates publicly, but because it forces the guilty to face themselves in silence. You let them believe you were harmless. You let them think forgiveness meant blindness. You let them call your patience weakness. But all along, you were documenting, waiting, allowing time to rip their masks away. And when the truth came, it came with no need for spectacle. Their own hands had written their own judgment. And now, they live with that agony. They can't rewrite it. They can't undo it. They can only replay it, over and over, realizing too late that the mercy they mocked was the stage for their execution. The most devastating strike you ever delivered was not your fury, it was your silence. And that is why they'll never forget the lesson your mercy carved into their memory. They wanted you loud. They wanted you broken, desperate, scrambling to defend yourself. In their minds, victory meant dragging you into the mud where their chaos ruled. They imagined you shouting, flailing, rushing to prove your innocence. They wanted the theater of your collapse, because that's what fueled their illusions of control. But you denied them the satisfaction. You didn't give them your panic. You didn't give them your tears. You didn't give them a performance they could point to and say, "See, I told you so." Instead, you gave them silence. And silence is a weapon they never expected. Most people think survival means noise, fighting back, explaining, screaming until they're heard. But true survival often looks like stillness. It looks like endurance. It looks like refusing to let someone else write the script for your reaction. And that's what unsettled them most. You weren't playing their game at all. Think of a building rigged with explosives. The crowd expects a dramatic fall, shouts, crashes, endless noise. But when the collapse comes, it happens in one deafening instant. The entire structure swallowed by dust. That's how your silence worked. You didn't respond piece by piece. You let the entire illusion fall at once. And when it did, it was undeniable. Because silence is not absence. Silence is preparation. Every quiet moment they mocked, you were gathering strength. Every insult they threw, you were stacking as evidence. Every false rumor they spread, you were letting time record. And when truth finally surfaced, it struck with precision, like a sniper's bullet, clean, final, irreversible. Here's the part psychology proves over and over again. Silence disarms. People crave reaction because reaction validates their schemes. If you argue, they twist your words. If you scream, they say you're unstable. If you retaliate, they play the victim. But when you give them nothing, no voice, no response, no theater, they have nothing to manipulate. They're left wrestling with shadows, swinging at air. That's why your endurance rattled them. Every day you stood firm. You shattered the story they were trying to paint. They said you'd fold, but you stood. They said you'd break, but you endured. Your survival itself became the evidence that destroyed their narrative. And then came the truth. When revelation arrived, it didn't need to be loud. It didn't need your defense. It didn't need dramatics. It simply stood on its own, undeniable and sharp. Their lies collapsed under the weight of reality, and they were left speechless. The silence you carried turned into a roar of proof they couldn't erase. That's the power of endurance. It doesn't rush to win arguments. It doesn't chase shallow victories. It waits until the right moment, and then it strikes in a way that cannot be undone. Think of water pressing against a dam. For years, it's silent, steady, unyielding. The builders mock its stillness, confident their walls will hold. But then one day, with no warning, the dam collapses. The silence was never weakness, it was gathering force. That's how your endurance worked. Quiet, patient, building until the weight of truth tore down everything they'd built against you. And here's what unsettles them now. It wasn't your anger that ended them. It wasn't retaliation. It wasn't a spectacle. It was survival. The fact that you endured every strike, every betrayal, every attempt to break you and still stood tall, that's what broke them. Because survival was proof. Proof that their schemes weren't enough. Proof that they weren't as powerful as they believed. Proof that you were stronger in silence than they were in noise. And the truth cut deeper than any blade. They expected to hear your voice trembling in defense. They expected to see you scrambling to hold yourself together. Instead, they saw you rise with evidence they could never refute. They thought silence meant defeat, but silence was strategy. They thought time was on their side, but time became your ally. And when it was over, when their lies collapsed in front of them, they realized something devastating. Your silence wasn't absence, it was judgment. That's why they can't escape the memory of it, because silence doesn't fade like words. Words are argued, twisted, forgotten. Silence lingers, silence echoes. Silence forces the guilty to sit with themselves, replaying their own actions with no noise to drown it out. That's the cruelty of truth. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need applause. It simply stands, and when it stands, nothing can move it. You survived in silence, and then you shattered them with truth. Not messy, not frantic, but precise. And they'll never forget the moment the silence they mocked turned into the strike that ended everything. Because in the end, what broke them wasn't your fury, it was your endurance. They wanted you to meet them on their battlefield, a place full of chaos, noise, and ego. They wanted you to fight on their terms, to trade insult for insult, to scramble and scream until both sides were exhausted. That's how they understood conflict. Whoever is the loudest must be the strongest. But you never gave them that. You refused to step into their arena. You refused to match their noise with more noise. And because of that, you didn't just avoid their trap, you deleted it entirely. Think of a fire. If you pour fuel on it, it grows. If you fight it with more fire, it spreads. But if you starve it of oxygen, it dies. That's what you did. You didn't argue. You didn't retaliate. You didn't match their theatrics. You starved them of what they needed most, your attention. And without it, their entire strategy turned to ashes. They thought you were afraid because you didn't respond. They thought you were cornered because you didn't perform. They mistook your stillness for surrender, when in reality it was the move they couldn't defend against. Imagine a radio blasting static. Most people would twist the dial, complain, shout back at the noise, try to overpower it. But the real solution is simple. You turn it off. Just like that. Silence. That's exactly what you did to them. You turned their volume down to 0, and it drove them mad. Because manipulators thrive on reaction. They crave it. They set fires just to watch people scramble. They survive on chaos because chaos distracts from their weakness. And when you didn't play along, when you didn't fuel the flames, their power collapsed. They weren't just losing a fight, they were losing the entire stage they had built. Here's what psychology calls it: extinction. When a behavior isn't rewarded with attention, it fades. That's what you forced on them. Every insult they threw, every rumor they spread, every attempt to bait you, it all landed in silence. It was like shouting into an empty canyon, hoping for an echo that never came. And with every failed attempt, their desperation grew. They got louder, they reached further, they tried harder to provoke you, but every effort only exposed them more. People began to see their obsession, their instability, their need for attention. While you stood steady, they unraveled in front of everyone. Think of two fighters in a ring. One swings wildly, throwing punches at the air, sweating, gasping, desperate to land a blow. The other doesn't move. He simply steps back, calm, watching the opponent punch himself into exhaustion. By the end, one is broken and the other is untouched. That's what happened. They fought shadows while you conserved your strength. And here's the part that will always haunt them. Without your participation, they had nothing. Their schemes only worked if you gave them oxygen. Their lies only lived if you tried to defend yourself against them. Their drama only grew if you stepped into it. By refusing to play, you didn't just beat them, you erased their entire game. That's why they can't let it go. They replay it endlessly, trying to figure out why they couldn't break you. They thought silence meant weakness, but silence was their undoing. You weren't ignoring them, you were dismantling them without lifting a hand. Because the truth is, you can't lose a fight you never enter, and that's what unsettles them most. They wanted to say, "We beat you." They wanted evidence of your collapse, but all they got was silence. And silence doesn't just defeat them, it humiliates them. Because now they know, deep down, that every scheme they built, every trap they laid, every word they spitted, all fell apart without you ever raising your voice. You didn't lower yourself to their noise. You made their noise irrelevant. And in the end, they weren't destroyed by your retaliation. They were destroyed by your refusal to acknowledge they even mattered enough to fight. They couldn't look away from you. The more they tried to convince others that you were irrelevant, the more obsessed they became. Every step you took, every choice you made, every subtle move in your life, it consumed their attention. You became the silent center of their world, even when they pretended you weren't. At first, they told themselves they were just keeping an eye on you. They said it was strategy. They said it was smart to track you, to study you, to gather information. But what began as curiosity turned into fixation. And what they didn't realize is that their obsession was not your downfall, it was theirs. Obsession always destroys the one who carries it. Think of a moth circling a flame. It can't resist the light. It tells itself it's in control, that it can hover forever without harm. But the closer it gets, the more inevitable its end becomes. The flame doesn't chase the moth. The flame doesn't even move. The moth destroys itself. That was them. Their eyes stayed locked on you until their wings burned. Studies in psychology prove this. Obsession hijacks the brain. It steals focus, drains energy, robs people of rest. It narrows vision until everything else fades. That's what happened to them. They spent sleepless nights whispering about you, desperate conversations analyzing your steps, frantic attempts to predict your next move, and in the process, they neglected themselves. They abandoned their own growth, their own balance, their own future, because they were too busy staring at you. And all the while, you didn't even have to move. You didn't have to retaliate. You didn't even have to acknowledge their existence. Your silence was enough. Their obsession became the cage. Every time they tried to study you, they revealed more about themselves, their motives, their fears, their insecurities. They thought they were tracking your patterns, but really, they were mapping their own downfall. Imagine someone standing in front of a mirror. They think they're watching you, but the reflection keeps showing them what they don't want to see. That's what your presence became, a mirror. Everything they despised in themselves showed up when they looked at you. Their greed, their envy, their hunger for control, it was written across their reactions. You didn't expose them, their obsession did. And here's the irony, they thought their fixation gave them power. They thought if they studied you long enough, they could outsmart you, outmaneuver you, predict your every move. But their fixation wasn't control, it was chains. The more they stared, the weaker they became. The more they analyzed, the more paranoid they grew. The more they tried to anticipate you, the more they revealed how much you mattered to them. You didn't chase them, you didn't retaliate, you didn't lift a hand, and still, they fell apart. That's the brilliance of restraint. You became the flame, steady, unmoved, and they destroyed themselves circling you. Think of a gambler at a casino. He becomes so obsessed with chasing one player's moves that he forgets his own game. He keeps watching, waiting, convinced the next hand will give him the upper edge. But while he's fixated, he burns through his chips, drains his energy, and loses everything. That's what they did. They wagered everything on breaking you, and in the process, they lost themselves. And the worst part, they can't admit it. To confess their obsession is to confess defeat. To acknowledge how much you consumed them is to acknowledge that you were never powerless. And so, they cover it with excuses, pretending it was strategy, pretending it was control, pretending it was strength. But their sleepless nights betray them. Their anxious conversations expose them. Their exhaustion shows the truth. Because obsession doesn't build power, obsession eats it alive. And while they were burning their energy watching you, you were building. You were growing in silence. You were strengthening yourself, focusing on your path, refining your discipline. While their world shrank around their fixation, yours expanded. While they lost time staring at you, you gained time investing in your future. That's the difference, and that's why they'll never forget this lesson. Your victory didn't come from fighting them. It came from letting them fight themselves. Their obsession was their executioner, and you never had to strike the blow. They thought they were the hunters, but in the end, they became the prey, trapped not by your hands, but by their own fixation. And you, steady as the flame, stood untouched while they destroyed themselves in the fire. They believed life was simple. They thought it was a game they could predict, a board they could control, a set of rules they could bend in their favor. To them, it was checkers, linear, basic, one move at a time. They assumed that if they studied your steps, dissected your choices, and tracked your habits, they would always stay ahead. But you weren't playing checkers. You were playing something far more complex. You weren't confined to the board they thought you were stuck on. You were rewriting the game altogether. And that's why they never saw the collapse coming, because they were fighting in an arena that no longer existed. Imagine two players sitting at a table. One is grinning, sliding pieces on a checkerboard, confident in every move. He believes the rules are obvious, the path to victory clear. But across from him, the other player isn't touching the same pieces. He's playing chess. His moves are layered, his strategies invisible, his vision far beyond the simple back and forth of checkers. The first player thinks he's winning, until he realizes too late that he's been playing the wrong game all along. That was you. You didn't just play differently, you changed the entire framework. Here's a truth history proves again and again. Revolutions are never won by obeying the old rules. They are won by rewriting them. That's what you did. While they tried to corner you within their system of gossip, theatrics, and shallow control, you had already stepped outside of it. Their weapons couldn't touch you because their weapons belonged to a game you had already outgrown. They thought they could predict you because they assumed you moved like them, chasing attention, hungering for validation, desperate for approval. But you weren't motivated by the same things. You weren't searching for applause. You were rooted in vision. And vision doesn't bend to shallow strategies. Vision rewrites the rules. Think of technology. For years, people competed to build faster horses. Then someone invented the car. The old competition didn't matter anymore. That's what you did. While they were busy racing in circles, trying to outdo each other in pettiness and noise, you were building something that made their entire race irrelevant. You weren't playing to be first in their game. You were inventing a new game where their rules collapsed. And that's what broke them. Because defeat is painful, but irrelevance is unbearable. They weren't just beaten, they were erased. Their schemes stopped working, not because you outfought them on their terms, but because you refused to fight on their terms at all. They built strategies for a battlefield that no longer existed, while you had already moved to higher ground. This is why they're so unsettled now. They can't figure out how you slipped away from their grip. They can't understand why their manipulations no longer sting. They replay every move, every tactic, trying to figure out where they went wrong. But the truth is, they didn't go wrong at one move. They went wrong by playing the wrong game altogether. And here's the cruel beauty of it: you never announced the shift. You never told them, "I'm not playing your game anymore." You simply stopped responding. You stopped giving them fuel. You stopped reacting. You started building on a different level. And by the time they realized it, it was too late. The board they were playing on had already been flipped upside down. Imagine a soldier storming a battlefield with swords and armor, confident in victory. But when he arrives, he discovers the enemy isn't there. The war isn't fought with swords anymore, it's fought with technology he can't understand. His weapons are useless, his training irrelevant. That's what happened to them. They arrived ready to fight you in the mud, but you weren't in the mud. You were 10 steps ahead, dismantling their entire system from a place they couldn't reach. And this is the wound they'll never heal from. They thought they were masters of the board. They thought they controlled the game, but you weren't a piece to be moved. You were the architect of an entirely new game. That's why your victory shook them so deeply. You didn't just beat them, you made their entire strategy meaningless. You didn't just outmaneuver them, you proved that their way of fighting was small, predictable, outdated. They were fighting to dominate a checkerboard, while you were moving across dimensions they couldn't even imagine. So now they live with the humiliation, not just of loss, but of irrelevance. They can't brag about a battle when the battlefield itself was dismantled. They can't claim victory when the rules they lived by no longer apply, and the silence that follows is unbearable, because it forces them to face the truth. They weren't defeated by noise. They were defeated by innovation. You didn't just outplay them, you deleted their entire playbook, and that's a lesson they'll never recover from. They thought victory was about cutting off your branches, your opportunities, your reputation, your connections. They believed that if they destroyed what was visible, they had destroyed you completely. They went after surface-level things, convinced that if they disrupted your outer life, your inner world would crumble along with it. But you didn't waste time swatting at their hands. You didn't chase after every rumor, every slight, every attack they launched at the surface. You went after the source. You struck at the root. Think about a puppet show. The crowd is watching the wooden figures dance on stage, strings jerking wildly. Most people would fight the puppets, trying to stop each arm from moving. But you weren't distracted by the display. You looked past the stage, into the shadows, and struck at the puppeteer. The second the strings were cut, every puppet fell silent. That's how you dismantled them. You didn't fight their little games. You destroyed the force fueling their games. And here's what they never saw coming. The most effective strike is not against the hand that swings. It's against the will that commands the hand. That's what you did. You didn't waste your energy wrestling with surface actions. You targeted the source of their schemes, the hidden energy feeding their attacks. Once that was neutralized, everything else collapsed on its own. Look at war history. Armies don't waste time chasing every soldier. They go after the supply lines. They strike at the resources, the command posts, the heart of the operation. Once those are cut off, the entire army falls apart, no matter how strong they looked on the field. That's what you did. You didn't waste time with their theatrics. You dismantled their supply line, the pride, the envy, the ego that powered their every move. They thought they could win by making noise. But you proved that true strength isn't in noise, it's in alignment. You stayed aligned while they burned their fuel. You stayed rooted while they lived shallow. They were frantic because they depended on constant validation to survive. You were calm because you depended on truth to endure, and truth doesn't need applause to keep breathing. That's why your victory cut so deep. They weren't just beaten at the surface, they were dismantled at the source. Imagine a tree. Someone swings an axe at the branches, breaking a few twigs, tearing a few leaves. It looks dramatic, but the tree remains. Meanwhile, another person takes the axe to the root. Silent, hidden, steady. When the root is gone, the tree falls, no matter how tall it once stood. You were the one who struck the root, and when the collapse came, it was unstoppable. That's what they can't recover from. They thought you were playing defense. They thought you were patching holes in your life, scrambling to fix what they tried to break. But you were never scrambling. You were dismantling their foundation while they laughed, too blind to see the cracks forming beneath their feet. And here's the cruel truth, they didn't even understand the fight they lost. Losing a battle you can see hurts, but losing a battle you never understood is unbearable. They kept telling themselves they were winning because they saw you calm, patient, unbothered. They thought your stillness meant they were ahead, but your stillness was strategy. By the time they realized what was happening, their entire framework had collapsed beneath them. And now, they replay it endlessly in their minds. How did this happen? How did we lose something we thought we controlled? The answer is simple. They were cutting branches. You were cutting roots. Their pride told them they were in control. But pride blinds. Pride makes people think surface victories matter more than structural ones. And pride always collapses when truth arrives. That's what you held on to truth. That's why they lost. Because truth dismantles illusions at the core, not just on the surface. So now they live in confusion. They see the ruins of their schemes, but they can't explain how it all fell apart, and that confusion is part of their punishment. Because the greatest wound is not just losing, it's losing without understanding why. You didn't just fight them. You dismantled the very force that powered them. You cut the strings, and the puppets fell. You severed the root, and the tree collapsed. You shut down the supply line, and the army surrendered. That's why their downfall was inevitable. Because you didn't just outlast them, you dismantled them at the source. And the silence of that victory will echo in them forever. They thought their strength was in the masks they wore. They polished their images, crafted their personas, paraded their false crowns as if those illusions gave them real authority. To them, power was performance, convincing others they were bigger, louder, stronger than they truly were. They lived for appearances because appearances were the only thing holding them up. But you didn't attack their bodies. You didn't go after their shallow displays. You went after the one thing they couldn't defend against, their mask. And when that mask cracked, everything they built collapsed with it. The sharpest blade isn't the one that cuts flesh. It's the one that slices through lies. That's the blade you carried. You didn't humiliate them by yelling. You dismantled them by exposing the truth beneath the costume. And that truth was simple. They were never as strong as they pretended to be. Think about a magician on stage. The crowd gasps as he makes objects vanish, levitates in the air, and pulls wonders out of thin space. For a while, people believe he bends reality itself. But then someone flips on the backstage light. Suddenly, the wires, the mirrors, the hidden props, all of it is revealed. The magician isn't wounded, but his power dies instantly. Because the illusion is gone. That's what you did. You didn't injure them. You didn't scream. You simply pulled the curtain, and once people saw behind it, the persona collapsed. Here's the fact most illusions hide. Borrowed power only exists as long as people believe in it. Once the illusion is shattered, it can't be rebuilt. That's why your strike was final. It didn't matter what words they used afterward. It didn't matter how much noise they made to cover it up. The illusion had been exposed, and once exposed, it could never command the same respect again. They told themselves your mercy was weakness. They told themselves your silence meant surrender. They told themselves their mask was strong enough to withstand truth. But truth has a way of breaking through, quietly, relentlessly, like light seeping through cracks in a wall. And once it shows, it spreads. It dismantles. It refuses to go back into hiding. And that's why their collapse rattled so many. Because it wasn't you tearing them down, it was the truth standing on its own. Truth doesn't need applause. Truth doesn't need defense. Truth doesn't need permission. Once revealed, it speaks for itself. Imagine a wall painted gold. From a distance it shines. People admire it, believe it's made of solid metal. But one storm peels the paint, and underneath is nothing but crumbling stone. That's what happened when their mask cracked. They had spent so much energy convincing others they were unshakable. But when the truth surfaced, people saw the fragility underneath. The gold faded, the illusion died, and nothing they did afterward could restore it. And you didn't even need to lift a hand. You didn't chase revenge. You didn't scream accusations. You simply stood steady while the mask dissolved on its own. That's the brilliance of your strength. You didn't have to destroy them. They destroyed themselves the moment the illusion failed. And what's worse for them is this. People don't forget when a mask breaks. They might forget arguments. They might forget gossip. But they never forget the moment they realize someone they admired or feared was fake. That's the wound your enemies now carry. Not just that they lost power, but that everyone saw the costume collapse. They live now in that shadow. And no matter how hard they try, no matter how loud they shout, they can't put the mask back on the same way, because everyone already knows what's underneath. That's why your strike was so complete. It didn't need violence. It didn't need spectacle. It needed only the quiet, patient endurance that let time reveal what was always there. You didn't just defeat them. You unmasked them. And the silence that followed their exposure was louder than any battle cry you could have ever made. They mistook purity for weakness. To them, innocence meant ignorance, softness meant fragility, and gentleness meant vulnerability. They looked at your kindness and thought it made you easy prey. They saw your patience and called it naivety. They convinced themselves you were someone they could toy with, someone who would never notice the games they played. But that was their first mistake, and their final one. Because what they thought was fragility was camouflage. What they thought was softness was strategy. What they thought was innocence was clarity. And clarity cuts sharper than any blade. Think about the butterfly. To the predator, It seems harmless, delicate wings, soft body, easy to catch. But sometimes, what looks harmless is designed to disarm. Hidden within bright colors or gentle patterns are signals of danger, toxins that predators cannot digest, power that doesn't announce itself until it's too late. That was you. They thought they were watching a creature too delicate to defend itself, but they never realized they were handling something untouchable. Here's what they didn't understand. Innocence isn't the absence of awareness. Innocence is freedom from corruption, and that freedom gave you vision they could never match. While they were clouded by envy, poisoned by pride, and addicted to lies, you saw clearly. You weren't blinded by ego, you weren't shackled by manipulation. Your so-called naivety was really your ability to see through the distortion that trapped them. That's why you never needed to out-scheme them. You weren't trapped in the fog of their illusions. You could read the currents they didn't even realize they were swimming in. Every lie left a flicker in their eyes. Every attempt at control revealed the fear inside them. Every game they played exposed their desperation. Your innocence wasn't blindness, it was a mirror reflecting their corruption back at them. And that mirror devastated them. Because what humiliates a manipulator more than anything? Being seen clearly. They thrive on confusion, on blurring truth, on convincing others that up is down and right is wrong. But when someone looks at them with clear eyes, when someone refuses to be tricked, when someone can stand gentle yet unshaken, the illusion collapses. You weren't predictable, you weren't controllable, you weren't weak, you were free, and freedom is terrifying to those who live enslaved to lies. Imagine a battlefield. One army comes covered in armor, bristling with weapons, shouting their strength. Across from them stands a soldier unarmored, calm, even smiling. The armored army charges, convinced they'll crush this weak opponent. But when they swing, their weapons shatter against a force they didn't see. Discipline, clarity, patience, the invisible strength of a spirit that cannot be broken. That's what happened to them. They thought you had no defenses. In reality, your innocence was the shield they could never pierce. And here's the cruel irony. What they mocked as weakness became the very thing that destroyed them. They thought you were harmless, so they underestimated you. They showed their hand too soon, revealed their motives too easily, dropped their guard too quickly. By the time they realized, it was too late. They weren't undone by your rage. They weren't dismantled by your revenge. They were defeated by the purity they ridiculed. That's the brilliance of your disguise. Innocence let you move unseen. It let you slip past their defenses. It let you dismantle their illusions while they laughed, thinking you didn't even understand the game. But the truth was, you understood it better than they did. You just refused to play it their way. And now they live with the torment. They replay every moment, realizing that the person they mocked as soft was the very one who held the sharpest clarity in the room. They thought you were fragile, but fragility doesn't endure storms. Fragility doesn't survive betrayal. Fragility doesn't outlast schemes. What you carried wasn't fragility. It was resilience wrapped in innocence. It was strength disguised as softness. That's why they'll never forget you, because they can't explain how someone so gentle dismantled them without lifting a hand. They can't understand how their arrogance blinded them so completely. They can't accept that the very thing they mocked was the weapon that destroyed them. Their pride cost them everything. And your innocence, your quiet, your clarity, your purity, was the camouflage that let you dismantle them from the inside out. So when they think back on their defeat, it won't be your anger that haunts them. It will be your smile. The smile they thought meant weakness. The smile that was really the shield they could never penetrate. The smile that told them, without a word, that you were never the fragile prey. You were always the unseen force. And in that realization, they were undone. They thought victory was something they could snatch away from you. They imagined that if they pushed you into the mud, forced you into their arena, dragged you into their contest of egos, they could crown themselves as champions. To them, victory was about domination, who looked stronger, who shouted louder, who demanded the spotlight, and refused to let it go. But you never stepped into their ring. You didn't chase victory the way they did. You didn't claw for validation or scramble to prove your worth. You didn't need to, because you weren't chasing victory, you were embodying it. That's what they never understood. Victory isn't always a prize handed out at the end of a fight. Sometimes, victory is a presence. It's the way someone carries themselves in silence. It's the calm assurance that says, I don't need to prove myself, I already know who I am. And that was you. Imagine two warriors standing on a battlefield. One is red-faced, screaming, swinging wildly, desperate to prove he's strong. The other stands still, sword sheathed, eyes calm, posture steady. He doesn't even need to raise his weapon, because his presence tells everyone the outcome is already decided. That was you. You didn't have to fight to win. You carried victory in your endurance, your composure, your unshaken spirit, and that's why they couldn't break you. Every scheme they tried failed. Every rumor eventually dissolved. Every betrayal turned back on them, not because you lashed out, but because you embodied something they couldn't touch. You carried a quiet strength that refused to bend to their chaos. Here's the truth. When someone is deeply aligned, attacks lose their power, lies don't stick, manipulations collapse, noise can roar, but it fades. Alignment is what endures, and you stayed aligned. That's why their efforts, no matter how dramatic, fell apart like paper in the rain. They expected you to chase, but you didn't. They expected you to fight for validation, but you never bowed to that need. They expected you to scramble, but you stood steady. And in that steadiness, you revealed the real difference between you and them. They were chasing a crown to look powerful. You had already become the crown. That's what destroyed them. Because what rattles an enemy more? Losing a fight they expected, or realizing there was never a fight to win in the first place? They discovered that all their energy, all their plots, all their theatrics, it was all wasted. Because you weren't even competing. You weren't trying to outrun them. You had already transcended the race they thought mattered. Think of a firefly in the dark. Other insects buzz loudly, fighting for scraps of attention. But the firefly doesn't argue. It doesn't scream. It simply glows. And its light silences the noise without a word. That's you. You didn't try to outshout them. You simply shined in a way that made their noise irrelevant. And here's the irony, they wanted you desperate. They wanted you to crumble, to claw for recognition, to prove them wrong. But the more you refused, the more they realized they weren't holding victory at all. Because victory isn't something that can be taken. Victory is a posture, and your posture never broke. Now they live with that realization. They replay their schemes, their plots, their desperate battles, and they can't understand why you're still standing while they're exhausted. They don't see it yet, but the truth is simple. You weren't playing their game. You were carrying victory from the start. They mistook quiet for weakness. They mistook calm for ignorance. They mistook composure for surrender. But what they didn't see was that every silent moment was proof of your triumph. You didn't need to argue. You didn't need to defend. You didn't need to swing wildly, because the outcome was already written, and you were already living it. That's what unsettles them even now. They wanted to win against you, but how do you defeat someone who isn't fighting? How do you steal victory from someone who already carries it inside them? You can't. And that's the wound they'll never heal from. They'll never forget the sight of you standing tall, unbothered, unshaken, undeniable. Because in that moment, they realized they weren't looking at a competitor. They were looking at the embodiment of the very thing they thought they were chasing. You weren't holding the trophy. You were the trophy. And that truth gutted them more than any weapon ever could. Patterns. That's where they believed their advantage lived. They had always depended on predictability, on the way most people panic when cornered, on the way anger flares when provoked, on the way desperation forces rash decisions. To them, control was about rhythm. If they could predict your rhythm, they could anticipate your every move. But you shattered that illusion. You became unreadable. You refused to fit into their script. You broke the rhythm they depended on, and in doing so, you destroyed the foundation of their control. Think of a boxer in the ring. He studies his opponent, waiting for the left jab, the predictable duck, the tired sequence that always comes under pressure. He builds his strategy around the rhythm. But then the opponent moves differently, silent, sharp, unpredictable. Every swing hits empty air. Every plan falls apart. That was you. They thought they knew how you'd respond. But each time they acted, you did something they didn't expect. And unpredictability is terrifying to a manipulator. They live off assumptions. They assume anger will rise when they poke you. They assume fear will paralyze you when they pressure you. They assume desperation will drive you to mistakes when they corner you. But every time they thought they had you figured out, you moved in a way they couldn't track. Sometimes you were calm when they expected fury. Sometimes you were silent when they expected argument. Sometimes you were kind when they expected revenge. And every time, their confidence cracked just a little more. Here's the truth. Unpredictability isn't chaos. It's mastery. It's control. Chaos is wild, messy, uncontrolled. But unpredictability is precision. It's choosing when to move and when not to, in a way that keeps your opponent guessing. Military strategy proves this. Armies that move in unpredictable rhythms dismantle even stronger forces because the enemy never finds footing. You embodied that principle. You became impossible to track. That's why their frustration grew. They weren't just angry at you, they were angry at themselves. Because the rhythm they trusted, the rhythm that gave them control, no longer existed. They were grasping at air, chasing shadows, trying to trap smoke, and the harder they tried, the more exposed they became. Imagine a card player convinced he knows your tells. He watches your every move, waiting for the nervous tick, the hesitation, the flicker of doubt. But instead, you give him nothing. A still face, a calm presence, no rhythm to follow, no weakness to exploit. Suddenly, his own tells begin to show, sweat on his brow, doubt in his voice. He crumbles under the weight of his own expectations. That was them. They lost not because you fought harder, but because they could never read you. And that is what made you untouchable. Because control doesn't come from being louder. It doesn't come from forcing reactions. It comes from refusing to be predictable, and you refused at every turn. Here's the irony: they called you confusing. They told themselves you were inconsistent, uncertain, even weak. But what they didn't understand was that unpredictability was your shield. It was the reason they never trapped you. It was the reason their strategies collapsed. You weren't playing to fit a pattern. You were playing to destroy the very idea of being predictable. And the longer this went on, the more their confidence drained. Every time they tried to corner you, you slipped away. Every time they thought they had the upper hand, you moved differently. Until eventually, they stopped feeling in control at all. That's the devastation they live with now. Not just that you won, but that they never even understood how. Their pride told them they could predict you, but their pride lied. And unpredictability was the weapon they could never defend against. They thought they were writing your script, but you were the one holding the pen. And by the time they realized that, the story was already finished. They were so sure you were the prey. In their arrogance, they convinced themselves you were the one being hunted, the target to stalk, the victim to break, the example they would use to feed their pride. They sharpened their arrows, whispered to one another about how easily you would fall, and congratulated themselves before the battle even began. But arrogance blinds, and while they were following your trail, convinced they had you cornered, they never saw the truth. You weren't the prey, you were the judgment. Every scheme they built, every trap they laid, every lie they whispered, was never shaping your downfall. It was writing theirs. Because that's the secret about traps: the one who sets them rarely checks if they're walking into one themselves. And with every step they took against you, they tied the knot tighter around their own fate. Imagine a hunter in the forest. He stalks footprints in the dirt, sure they belong to helpless prey. He crouches low, aiming his bow, ready for the strike. But what he doesn't realize is that his path has been leading him into a snare hidden beneath the leaves. He believes he is seconds away from victory, but the rope that will pull him into the air is already beneath his feet. That's what happened. They thought they were hunting you, but you were the quiet judgment waiting all along. And the truth is, you didn't even need to move. You didn't need to retaliate. You didn't need to set new traps. All you had to do was stand in alignment and let their actions loop back onto themselves. History proves this again and again. Empires don't always fall because of an outside enemy. They collapse because of the weight of their own arrogance. Corruption breeds paranoia. Paranoia fuels mistakes. Mistakes fuel collapse. That's what you witnessed. Your enemies weren't destroyed by your hands. They were destroyed by their own. And that's the agony they live with now. They told themselves they were weaving your ending, but in reality, every thread was part of the rope around their own neck. Every lie they told left a record. Every scheme they hatched exposed another weakness. Every insult they threw chipped away at their own mask. They thought they were building a cage for you, but it was their own prison they locked themselves into. That's the brilliance of judgment. It doesn't need to chase. It simply waits. And when the moment comes, it's undeniable. Think of a man digging a pit to trap another. He spends hours sweating in the sun, convinced of his genius. He tells himself that the victim will never see it coming. But the ground collapses beneath him, and he falls into the very pit he created. That was them. They weren't architects of your fall, they were builders of their own. And here's the cruel twist: they never realized it until it was too late. They spent so much time obsessed with how they would break you that they didn't notice how much they were breaking themselves. Their health faltered, their relationships cracked, their reputation eroded, all because they couldn't take their eyes off of you. And you didn't have to retaliate. You didn't have to announce anything. You simply stood in alignment, calm, steady, watching the unraveling unfold. That's what unsettles them now, not that you fought them, but that you never had to. Because their collapse wasn't a result of your strike, it was the natural conclusion of their arrogance. They wanted to see you in chains. They wanted to see you broken, mocked, erased. Instead, they became the ones caught in the snare. They became the ones judged by their own deeds. And the silence of that collapse echoes louder than any revenge could have. Because judgment doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives quietly, letting people destroy themselves while you stand as witness. You weren't the hunted. You weren't the prey. You were the silent judgment waiting for them all along. And now they live with the truth that every step they took against you was really a step toward their own ruin. They thought their stories about you would define your ending. They thought their laughter would write your legacy. They believed that if they whispered loud enough and schemed long enough, the world would accept their version of you. To them, the future was theirs to shape, and you were just a character in their script. But they forgot one thing: you were never theirs to define. Every time they mocked you, every time they doubted you, every time they convinced themselves you were finished, you were quietly building. They looked at what they could see, but they never noticed what was happening beneath the surface. You weren't broken, you were becoming. Imagine a seed buried in the soil. To the one looking down, it appears lifeless, forgotten, even dead. Weeks go by, and they laugh at the silence. But beneath the soil, roots are spreading, unseen. And then one day, the seed breaks through the dirt, stronger than anything they expected. That was you. They mistook your silence for an ending, when it was really the beginning of your rise. And when you rose in a way they couldn't stop. Here's the truth: they weren't just wrong about you. They were blind to the truth of who you always were. You didn't survive because you were lucky. You didn't outlast them because you were hidden. You rose because you were built for endurance, forged for clarity, designed to walk through storms without losing your way. That's why their weapons didn't land. That's why their laughter couldn't bury you. That's why their schemes collapsed while you kept standing. Because you weren't shaped by their opinions. You were shaped by your endurance. Think of a chessboard. They thought they were players moving you around like a pawn, but pawns only move forward, one step at a time. What they didn't see was that your quiet moves weren't weakness, they were strategy. You weren't a pawn, you were the queen. And when the moment came, you didn't just survive the board, you dominated it. And now, they can't escape the unease. Because their greatest fear has come true. The one they underestimated became the one who dismantled them, without a single weapon in hand. They thought you were forgettable, but your rise made you unforgettable. They thought you were weak, but your endurance proved you were unbreakable. That's the lesson they'll never forget. Not just that you survived, not just that you endured, but that you thrived in silence until the moment arrived for you to rise. They live with the memory of underestimating you. They live with the humiliation of realizing their arrogance fed your victory. And they live with the truth that no matter how hard they tried, they never had the power to write your ending. Because your ending was never theirs to write. You wrote it yourself. And you wrote it with patience, with resilience, with silence that turned into strength. You wrote it in the moments they mocked, in the seasons they thought you were gone, in the quiet hours where you sharpened your spirit. And when the time came, you didn't just reveal who you were, you revealed who they had never been. You weren't the fool. You weren't the weak one. You weren't the background character. You were the force moving silently in the shadows, the storm gathering beneath the calm, the presence they never expected to face. And now they know. They know that while they laughed, you endured. While they schemed, you built. While they wasted themselves on noise, you mastered the art of silence. And when silence finally spoke, it shattered everything they thought they knew. So here's the final truth. You didn't just win. You didn't just outlast. You became the proof that the underestimated are always the most dangerous. You turned their arrogance into their downfall, their schemes into their chains, their laughter into the echo of their own regret. And long after their noise fades, long after their games dissolve, long after their names are forgotten, the memory of your endurance will remain, because they thought they were writing your story. But in the end, it was you who closed the book.